Okay, I'm gonna record this. All right, let's pretend like I just started. All right, so if you're multiplying a real times an imaginary, you just multiply the 5 times 2, 10 I. So just multiply the numbers and you I. And if you are multiplying negative 3I times 6, that would be negative 18I. So straightforward, real times imaginary, just multiply the numbers. But it's when you're multiplying i's, and you guys should probably already know this, but I is the square root of negative 1. So if you do I, the square root of negative 1, times the square root of negative 1, well, the rule is anytime you multiply two square roots that are the same, you get that number. The square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is 5. Square root of 12 times the square root of 12 is 12. So the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 is negative 1. So when you do 4i times 3i, this would be 12i squared. You don't have to write that if you just remember that I squared is negative 1. So this would be like having 12 times negative 1 or negative 12. So a negative 6 times 2 would be a negative 12 I squared. But again, negative 12 times negative 1, it's going to change that to a positive 12. So anytime you have an I times an I, it's going to change your sign. Questions on that? It just is what it is. Now, we don't get into all of this, but, you know, I to the I is just I squared is negative 1. I to the third power then would be negative I, and then I to the fourth power would be back to positive 1. And then it repeats. I to the fifth is I to the sixth is negative 1, I to so forth. But you just need to remember I squared is negative 1. Still waiting on my snow. Everyone woke up early, made a fire in my fireplace, all ready for snow today, and nothing. It's wet. It's going to change. Okay, here we go. So don't forget that's a negative 1 there. So 7 times negative 7. And then I squared would be negative 1. So that's 7. Negative times negative is positive, but I times I is negative 1. So this would be negative 36, right? So it would be the positive 36 and the I squared, which would be a negative 1. So it's like having three negatives because the 9 is negative, the 4 is negative, and the two i's would make another negative. All right, so let me pause right here and tell you guys a little story. So a long time ago when I was in college, I was at West Virginia University. And so West Virginia is up here. Myrtle Beach is down here, and there used to be an Easter festival every year at Myrtle Beach that we would go to. And of course, Chapel Hill is here. And I had a friend that was going to University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So we would drive down on the Thursday before Easter, pick him up, go over to NC State. I had another friend there, pick him up, and then we would all go to the beach together, spend the weekend, and then on Easter Sunday, would drive back to Chapel Hill and then go back. Well, we decided one year not to stay until Easter Sunday. We decided to head back late Saturday night, so we didn't have to pay for another night there and just stay in Chapel Hill and then drive back to West Virginia on Sunday. Well, somehow I was driving, somehow on the way back, I got turned around here and ended up at the gates of Hope Air Force Base, which is nowhere near Chapel Hill. No idea where we were. And a airman, Air Force guy, gets dropped off in a cab. So we called him over to the car and said, hey, we're lost. Can you tell us how to get, like, we're trying to go. He's so drunk, Saturday night, getting dropped off at base and could barely stand up. And he's like, you guys are so lost. And so he told us how to get back to the interstate and get back to where we were going. But the point of the story is, as we were driving off, windows down, he yells out, don't do drugs. So every Friday, when you hear me tell you, every Friday, don't do drugs when we leave, that's what it's in reference to. So I've told that to my students every Friday since I started teaching. So at the end of the day, don't do drugs. And have a nice weekend. All right, so back to this. Distributed property, right? So if you're doing just a 1 times group, you're just going to distribute. So 4 times 2 is 8, minus 4 times 5i would be 20. Oh, jumped out of nowhere. 20i. Yeah. So there's no I here, nothing to worry about. Just multiply times both of them. But if it does have an I, be careful, because 3i times 4 would be 12i. But then 3i times 2i would be 6i squared. I squared is -1. So that's actually 12i minus 6. And then if you're taking a multiple choice test, it'll probably be written in standard form with the real number first and then the imaginary part. It'll get switched around. So when you're distributing an I, it actually changes the real to imaginary and the imaginary to real. That's a beautiful map, I know. All right, so a couple more, and then we'll let you get to your work. If it ever changes pages. All right, so distributing a -5i, and you might want to, do the 2 steps. So -5 times 2 is -10i. Negative times a negative would be a positive. 5 times 4 is 20. I and I be I squared. So that would make a -1. So you have -10i minus 20. And then if you leave it like this, that's fine. This is as long as you know which is the real part and the imaginary part. Just know that this would be the way it'd be written on a multiple choice quiz. All right, and then -8i times -8 would be 64i. Negative times -3 would be a -24i squared, which again is -1, which would make that a 64i plus 24, or 24 plus 64i. And be careful, make sure that I stays with the 64 when you switch it around. Don't choose the multiple choice one that says 24i plus 64. Be careful about that. Or it just moves the I to the wrong one. Double check. I think that all right, so that I did have, stop sharing and let's